All right, so hopefully I can get through this one without losing audio, and hopefully it will be useful to some of you to help with the questions that I've been getting and some that I anticipate. All right, so first and foremost, let me go over some goals here. How to start a session, the basic settings that I want you to pay attention to, what ultimately is created in a session folder where that will live, etc. A little bit about the playback engine. Go over, review some things about the edit window, in particular, what some buttons do, columns and rulers, which have to do with some of the questions I've been getting, and then review the edit modes and the edit tools, since those are the critical things to just start navigating the program. So what I've done here is I have a screenshot of the launch dashboard. So when you launch up Pro Tools, this should pop up. And what you're going to see, and I'm not sure if this is the default, the first thing you'll see, but I think it may be because of some things I've heard and seen. It will have create from template checked. And I want you to uncheck that because what a template is a pre-built session with the idea that based on these genres of blues, drum and bass, dubstep, etc., that you're going to want certain types of tracks, certain types of instruments even, and certain types of routing of your aux inputs and things of that nature. So I've always thought that it's much more important to understand how to build a session as opposed to try and use something that has been pre-built for you. So we're going to avoid using templates for now. What we might end up doing is actually creating templates for specific things that we're going to be doing. You do want to have local storage checked. That just means that it's going to be saved to your computer as opposed to in the cloud or backed up to the cloud. That does allow for some collaboration elements, but you can't actually use them because I own all of the licenses that you're operating under. If you had your own license, then we could actually share sessions back and forth. Okay, so of course we're going to name our session. It won't be untitled. File type is WAV. Now, if you were to click on that, you'd see, I believe the only other option these days is AIFF, which was a Mac standard when WAV was a PC or Windows standard back in the day. They're of equal quality, although some people go into the depths and see if they can tell the difference. But WAV won that battle essentially, and it has become a general standard. I've always said in the past to use 44.1 kilohertz, and typically if you only record at 44 or 48, 44 is often decided, used as the music standard, while 48 is the video standard. And one reason is for that is that CD quality audio, which is 44.1 kilohertz sample rate and 16-bit depth, if you did your recordings at 44.1, you didn't need to essentially sample down or dither too much in order to get to your final output parameters. I want you to use 48, if only because Zoom uses 48 kilohertz as its communication protocol. So if we are able to share sessions over Zoom, I am anticipating that 48K is going to be a better standard for us. Bit depth ultimately is somewhat irrelevant unless you're recording audio. I always say go ahead and use the best that you can, but it is related. Ultimately, both of these things are related to how much disk space would be used. The higher, the better quality, but also the more disk space used as you're recording. We will get into that later. I/O settings should be last used because really you only have your computers, most of you. If you have a complex, or if you have a interface, there's going to be some different things that you could do with that, but last use is fine. Interleaved. Now, typically I actually don't check interleaved, but I'm going to tell you what it is so that you understand. Pro Tools back in the day handled stereo audio tracks differently than most DAWs, and it handled them as individual mono audio tracks. And that's why you would see something like .l .wave or .r .wave when you imported a stereo audio track. It would look, you could play with it or edit it in stereo, but ultimately they were individual audio tracks. I have found that to be useful at times, to be able to pull one side of a stereo audio track and use it as a mono track, especially if someone sent me, for example, a bass track that was recorded. For some reason they outputted it as a stereo, but I want to use it as mono when I'm mixing. So I would just pull the left side of it and kind of say, this, I'm going to use this one, use it in mono. Sits better for me in the mix as a mono track. I'm not going to spend too much time because I could go on for days as to why certain synth sounds also are not true stereo, but you're not that interested and it's not useful right now. Location. I want to make sure that you have, or at least I find it the easiest, and I recommend for you. I think the default is the documents folder, and that's ultimately fine. I'm not going to yell at you about it because I'm not there. But I tend to choose the desktop just so that I can see my session folders very quickly. It does lead to a dirty desktop, and a dirty desktop's not good, but you can always reorganize things. And then once we have all these things and we name our session, we're going to go ahead and hit create. Once you start working on projects, you can always click on recent and you'll see a list of your most recent projects, and there you have it. Okay, so I'm going to close this, and boom, our session has started up, and we have our blank edit window. All right, so before I get into Pro Tools, I do want to go back and say that I had said that we wanted to talk about what's inside of a session folder when you create it. And if I double click on this, here is my review the interface session that I created. Some of these folders and files will disappear unless I bring things in to the session in order to fill them. I'm not going to guarantee that because sometimes things surprise me. But for example, I expect that the video files folder or even the audio files folder may disappear because I have no audio files in this project as of yet, and may not. You have your bounce files folder, which is the default destination when you export or bounce to disk. Clip groups we'll get into later, but essentially it's editing groups. You have your executable, the .ptx file. So this is the file that basically holds most of the information about the session: settings, routing, plugins, etc. You can always double click on this. It will launch Pro Tools and take you directly to this particular session. You have your session backups folder, and this is a really important one. We can joke that Pro Tools can crash. Every program can crash. Pro Tools is there as well. And the default in the preferences is that your session is saving every 5 minutes. And, that's just a good thing, so that if you're working on something, you'll never really lose any more than 5 minutes of your work. Now, of course, that 5 minutes could be the most brilliant 5 minutes you've ever had, but albeit it's not that huge of a deal. So if you ever do, if a project crashes and you lose some work, you are not up the creek. You are able to come back and just, relaunch your session from the most recent backup. Then I choose to then save as and take away all of these additional naming components so that it just rewrites over my highest, the visible executable session file, I should just say. All right. So session backups is hugely important. Video files, of course, is empty unless you're working with video, and place a video in that folder. The wave cache is an important file. It actually stores the actual waveforms of a session. So if you have an audio heavy session, this wave cache is going to actually be rather large and be filled with all of the not the waveforms, not the audio files themselves. They're just sitting here, just the images, the drawings of those wave files. So if for some reason, this one definitely disappears if you don't have audio. If you delete this for any reason, it's just going to require Pro Tools to take longer to launch your session as it redraws those waveforms in the session. All right, so your folder is an important piece of info and just something to know. All right, so I'm going to go back and reset my tempo to the standard default, and here we are in the blank edit window. Let's go ahead and make a track. I'm going to make a click track. I always think, and I stand by it, that a click track is an important thing to have because it is a reference. And if you don't know how fast you are playing to, you won't get anything. You don't know what you're going to be getting. All right. I am going to kind of do this thing with my tracks just in case I end up losing audio. Should have double checked that earlier, but I think it's okay. All right, so we have our click track at 120. I'm going to go ahead and make a stereo instrument track. I will call it drums. I'm going to go ahead and make a stereo master fader. No, not a basic folder. That's actually new in Pro Tools 2020. We'll be getting into that for those of you who have 2020. And for those of you who don't, you'll get to hear about it anyway. Okay, so again, hopefully everything is audible. What I'm actually doing right now is assigning the output that is standard to my headphones to also go output 6 and 7, which is this audio utility that I have routed to QuickTime for the use of the video. All right, so I have 2 tracks. Now, a number of you have said, hey, I don't have a place to input my instruments. And right away, we need to set up our columns. But before we get into that, I said I was going to talk about the playback engine. So if you go to Setup in Playback Engine, there are a couple of things that I'd like you to know here. And most importantly is that the playback engine essentially chooses your inputs and outputs, not specifically like input 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, but it establishes, hey, Pro Tools, I am using a Focusrite interface, and it has 4 inputs, 4 analog inputs, 4 digital inputs, and it also has 8 outputs. Or I am using the stereo microphone, the 2 inputs from my microphone, and the 2 inputs left and right of my computer outputs. They are put together into what's called an aggregate I/O. So Pro Tools has pre-built, so most of you should probably see Pro Tools aggregate I/O up here, and that consists of the microphone input on the computer and essentially the speakers of the computer. And of course, if you plug in some headphones, which I highly recommend, it would, those would still be the speakers of the computer, but it's your headphones. Now, this is something that we might be changing if in order for us to share audio over Zoom, and we'll get to that when the time comes. The hardware buffer size, I want you to think of a buffer as a temporary memory, essentially, so that while you're playing back or recording, Pro Tools is kind of looking ahead, taking information, digital information, putting it into a temporary memory, and then spitting it out as it needs to perform its tasks and play back the sound that you're playing with, whether it's audio or instruments, etc. The one thing that I want you to know about this is that you can set a low sample buffer size or a high sample buffer size. The typical rule of thumb is, and this has everything to do with the concept of latency. Um, when you're recording, and if you have an interface, you plug a microphone in or you plug an instrument in, it is very, very common once you set that track into record ready and can hear it, that you'll hear a slight delay, kind of like you say hello, and it just comes back, a number of milliseconds late, enough that you can hear it and it throws you off a little bit. So low latency or zero latency recording is the goal always. And usually you need either a really good interface or, software and hardware combinations to eliminate latency. Or, on the other hand, you need to monitor the input before it goes through the computer. Hard to explain by just talking about it. But what I want you to take away from this is that if you are recording, you want to have as low a hardware buffer size as you can that will still play back your session. So if I'm recording, 20 microphones at once, I don't think 32 samples is going to do it. But maybe if I just have an acoustic guitar track and I want to sing, 32 samples would do it. And that would eliminate or lessen that latency as you're recording. When you're mixing and playing with virtual instruments, you are going to need a higher sample buffer size sample level, because you're going to be adding plugins and a whole bunch of effects and things of that nature, and it needs to be able to gobble up much more of that temporary information to then spit it back at you as you're asking it to do its thing. All right. In this window, you also have, the ability to enable the video engine, which you should not do unless you are going to be working with video. It actually takes a good 3 gigs of RAM away from Pro Tools, and we want as much as we can. I'm going to kind of leave these other things alone as kind of standard placement parameters, and we'll come back and talk about them as we get to the Beyond the Beat stuff. So, playback engine. Now I want to get back to what I was originally saying about how do we set up Pro Tools so that we can actually put our instruments in. And remember that I always use that term insert. You insert your instruments. And what's missing is the insert column. And what we see in Pro Tools is across the toolbar here or across the left-hand side is highly customizable, because depending what we're doing, and once we set things up, we can hide things so we have more real estate available to see what it is that we're working on. So in any case, in order to customize and choose the columns that we want to see, we come over to this white triangle, the Edit Window View Selector. Just again, very good to know that when you hover over anything, most things, for any period of time, it will kind of tell you what it is. But you come over here to that selector and click on it, and you see a host of different things that you can add. You can add a comments window, which I'm going to leave there for column, and I'm going to leave that there for a second. The one that you really want is inserts A through E. You actually have up to 10 inserts available, but until you fill up those first 5, there's no reason to give up your real estate for another 5. The sends as well, you can have sends. I tend to let them live in the mix window because that's my workflow. When I'm mixing and I want to send stuff on an aux or to an aux, I'm in that process. I'm in a different mindset than I am in terms of editing, and I don't really need to see them. I do like to see the I/O because I like to split up my drums and stuff like that, and I like to see the instrument so that I can assign MIDI channels as needed. The columns I'm not going to leave here, but I do want to explain how cool they are, or what they're used for, what useful for. Is if you're recording or you're sharing a session with someone and you want to be able to leave some crumbs along the way about what you're doing, you can click in here and actually take notes and leave some comments. So for example, if this was my kick track, I might say that this was the AKG D112, which is a microphone, and that it was routed through the Universal Audio channel 1 preamp, and that the setting was, at about 50% or something like that. All right, so you can leave all this information, very useful, and it can be anything, hey, I made some edits that you might want to check out. And you can hide it, and come back to it. The contents is always going to be there, but you don't always need to see it. I'm actually going to get rid of the instrument too, because I don't need it right now. All right, so inserting instruments. Let's go to the drum track. Actually, look, let me just double check. Starting session, the settings, components, did that. Playback engine, ins and out, hardware buffer size, did that. We're getting to some buttons. We got to the columns. Let's talk about the rulers and get that out of the way. Rulers are also customizable. So you come up to this black drop down and you can choose a whole bunch of different stuff. Time code is more related, as is to video, feet and frames to film. Samples, we'll get into it some other time. Meter is useful if you're doing a song that changes from 4/4 to 3/4 or 4/4 to 6/4, whatever. Most of us probably won't be doing that, so we don't need to have that. If you want to leave some notes in terms of the key of the song or the chord changes for musicians or for other people to kind of see, at measure 4 it goes to D minor, and you can kind of put that info in as you go. So a little chord thing, and you can kind of put that in, click that, and say, oh, look. And they even give you some tabs, which is kind of cool. The ones that I always recommend having are bars and beats, because that's what we're doing. We're making music, and it depends on which one you have selected is what you see in your counter. So minutes and seconds would change it to time. Bars and beats is music. It also changes often. It changes your grid information. And I think that it's most important to keep your grid information music when you're making music. Markers. Markers are super cool in terms of kind of placing out an arrangement of a song. Again, I'll use measure 4. Actually, measure 5 would be more realistic because music goes in 4s. If at measure 5 we go to a pre-chorus or a bridge, you can go marker, and you can call it pre-chorus 1, boom. And here you have kind of a visual marker as to the pre-chorus. And there are some quick keys to get back to that point. And this, again, not so important right now, but just a thing that's useful as you develop larger projects and more complex songs. So again, I think minutes and seconds is important just because I like to know how long a song is. And then, of course, tempo, because we want to be able to set our tempo. We want to be able to create dynamic tempo maps at some time and things like that. So tempo is obviously important. Okay, let's get an instrument in here finally. So clicking in Insert A, I'm going to choose, because this is a stereo track. We will talk about why there's also multi-mono available, but let's just go into multi-channel instrument. Some people have been asking, hey, where's battery? Hey, where's absinthe? Where's massive? You don't have them, and I apologize for that, but it just is reality. I have 35 licenses for those products. They are made by a company called Native Instruments, and I can't get them to you, and I apologize. We have them set up in the lab, but not for you. Sorry. So what you all should see is Boom, which is a drum machine, kind of a 16th note, 16 button drum machine. We'll go over it because you haven't. You should learn how to use it. DB33 is an organ instrument. Mini Grand is a piano. Structure Free is a sampler. Vacuum is an analog synth. And Expand is our kind of Swiss Army knife. And I will probably do all of these introductory videos using Expand. So yeah, I'm going to put in Expand. I'm going to go up to my presets and kind of go around, choose a drum set because that's what I want to do. And I am going to choose it. And I won't spend time going through things about expand right now, but maybe in another video. So I have an instrument. If I open up my MIDI editor, I can hear the different sounds. I can put in, I tend to not like that anyways, so good. Wait, why can't I put in, let's see, why can't I put in? There we go. All right, a kick drum on beat 1, a snare drum on beat 2, a kick drum on beat 3, but also one on the 4th, 16th note of beat 2, and a snare drum on beat 4. I will put in an 8th note hi-hat pattern. And I will also put in another kick drum. The most played out and universal hip-hop drum beat ever. Actually, if we're going to do that, we got to take our last hi-hat and make it open. Okay, changing tempo. I'm going to actually kind of introduce something that might be slightly different. So obviously, or hopefully you remember that if you hit return and click on this button here, you can change your tempo. Technically speaking, it's a tempo change. And that's why so often beginners, forget to hit return, they change their tempo, and they end up with a second tempo here. And very soon, you're going to learn in what situations we do want to do that, and we'll learn how to use that as to our benefit. But what we're going to do is we're going to come over, wow, my computer screen is very small. We're going to come over to the MIDI controls and talk about this for a second. The conductor, which really, if I simplify it, basically turns off the ability to make tempo changes. But it allows us to kind of just come up here, either scroll or just highlight and input a tempo. And that will set 85 as our tempo for the whole song, and no risk of being able to change tempos because this button no longer does anything. A couple more things about the MIDI controls since we're here. You can turn on and off your metronome. I don't tend to do that because I just mute my click. It's basically the same thing. A count off, if you're recording and you want an 8 count before you get started, putting in or activating the count off would do that. If you double click on your metronome, you can see some click and count off options, like do you want to hear the click the whole time or only when you're actually recording, or during playback and recording, only during recording, or only during the count off. Only during the count off would be useful for a band, except maybe the drummer who wants to hear a click, things like that. You can change the length of the count off. You can turn off the count off. But how confusing would that be to have your count off illuminated, but then not hear it? So that's another thing about Pro Tools, is that you can always kind of do things in different places in different ways, and that would end up messing you up. So be careful. Let's see, meter over here is kind of cool. So if you double click, because if you remember, you may not, if you remember in, come on people, in my head, Soundtrap, you only had 3/4 and 4/4 as options for your time signature or meter. Those words are synonymous. And remember that meter means how many beats per measure. So in 3/4 time, you have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay, like a waltz. In 4/4 time, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4. So meter is, in music is super important, and Pro Tools allows you to basically input any time signature that you want, whether it's 6/4, 3/4, 12/8, whatever. You can also change your click, but leave that as quarter notes. And then you have your tempo, okay? This last button over here, this is MIDI merge. And remember that this is the one that when you are recording, if you have a MIDI keyboard in front of you and you have already recorded something and you just want to add something and not delete everything that you have already recorded, leaving MIDI merge engaged will allow you to add to what you previously recorded. But if you do want to record over it, disengage that, okay? Couple more things, okay? Again, this hopefully is pretty obvious, or you remember it, that slip mode allows you to kind of move freely in between grid lines, while grid mode snaps and only allows you to move between the grid lines. In Soundtrap and most other DAWs, I believe, that is actually called snap to. But it's called grid in Pro Tools. I always say program your music in grid, record your audio or edit your audio in slip. I should say edit, it's unrelated to recording. And the reason for that, especially when you're starting out, is just to make sure that you place your notes on beat. Now, one could argue that that's going to cause your music to sound robotic and overly quantized, quote unquote, and we'll talk about quantization later. And that's true. It's not a falsity, but there are ways to offset your quantizing to kind of bring some humanistic elements back, and it's better than being offbeat. So being slightly robotic but being accurate is better than being offbeat, in my opinion. Okay, so we have our drum beats. Coming over here, again, these are preset zoom levels. You can set them yourselves. I tend not to use them. I am all about the command and the bracket signs. On a PC, that should be control and the bracket buttons on your keyboard. You can use horizontal zoom. If you have MIDI notes not in this view, you can zoom vertically. I'll show you that some other time. If you have audio, you can zoom vertically in order to see more of the waveform if you need a better visual for editing. This is tab to transients. I leave it engaged. It is pretty irrelevant unless you're working with audio. Link timeline to edit selection. I'm not going to get into it, but leave these preset defaults. Okay, just leave them. Don't press on anything. This one here, I want you to know what it is immediately, because if it is set as a default, I forget. It essentially does not allow. It means that when you start playing, say I'm at beat 3, and I stop, it's going to continue playing from where I stopped. And for music making, if I want to listen to something starting at beat 3, the likelihood is I want to hear it again and again and again. So I don't use that for music making. Again, we'll get into these some other time. You can zoom, you can kind of click and zoom, but I don't use that one either. Trim tool. Okay, just reminders. This is reminders and kind of very, very important. Trim tool works from one side or the other to kind of edit a clip down. Remember that any region in most DAWs is called a clip in Pro Tools. Used to be called regions in Pro Tools, but it's now a clip. The selector tool allows you to select parts from within a clip if you want to delete it or whatever. The grabber tool allows you to, with one click, highlight an entire clip and click and drag it. You can select a clip with a double click of the selector, but you can't move it anywhere. So it's not that useful. Well, it is, I should say. But that leads me to the point of using the Smart tool. Remember the Smart tool. If you click in this frame here, it activates the Smart tool, which gives you access to all of these depending where you place your cursor around the clip. So if you come to one side or the other, you can see that my cursor turned into the trim tool. If you focus on the center of this clip, what I call the equator, if I am above the equator, I get my cursor is the selector. As soon as I go below the equator, I have the grabber tool. This is incredibly important for efficiency. It makes no sense, no one can argue with me on this one, that you are using the selector tool and you say, oh, I need to move it. So I'm going to come up here and click on the grabber so I can move it. And then I want to trim it and do all that. That makes no sense. So learning how to use the Smart tool, I think, is obvious. Put it that way. Moving to the side here, I'm not going to do too much more. We have the counter, which kind of tells us a few things, where our playback head is. And what I mean by playback head, it's using an old school reference to tape machines. But basically where I place my cursor, it shows me where my starting point is, which is beat 2 of measure 1. As in playing, shows you where you're going and stuff like that. If you have a selection, it shows you the starting point of that selection and the ending point of that selection and the overall length of the selection. So if I duplicate this and highlight both of them, I have a 2-measure length and etc. And that can be useful at times. By the way, highlighting an entire clip, hitting Command D or Control D is going to get you that duplication. That is an important one. The grid, okay? This button right here turns the grid on and off. It's just the visual. Leave it on. There are very few times that I feel that it should be off, and I can't think of one. If you find it ugly and you're recording a band and you're not going to be doing anything in grid mode, sure, turn it off. But I don't see even that being that annoying. The grid value, okay, so these are two different things. The grid value is how many lines and how many grid points do you want to see. Typically, I leave it at 16ths. It is enough to do most programming, a lot of programming, and it's not too many so that the grid is kind of overly filled with lines that aren't that useful. There are times when you want to change this, and we'll get more into that using the MIDI editor. Over here, I want you to leave this as follow grid. All right, and that is more, again, related to MIDI programming, that when you have your MIDI editor, and this is the same thing right here, the duration to follow the grid, that when I'm inserting a note, if my grid is 16th notes, the likelihood is that I want to put in a 16th note if I click quickly, or that I want to click and drag and I can do anything I want. If this for some reason is set to bar and I click a note here, it is going to be a measure long. And there might be times that's useful, and now you know that you can set that. But for the most part, I leave that as follow the grid. You have your grid lines here as well, so you can make those disappear. You have your grid value. It is the same as what's set in the edit window. All of these tools are the same. One thing I'm going to go ahead and get into this video, which is going to make it go a little longer, and I could probably get in trouble for doing that. If you click on this is called the freehand pencil tool, and that allows you to draw kind of long notes, short notes. If you click quickly, it's going to be whatever your grid is set to with follow grid, or whatever this duration note is set to. If you click and hold on this and choose the line tool, you can click and draw the notes based on the grid value. So if you are a trap head, and I say that with all, the love that I have, you might want to set your grid to 30 seconds or 64ths, and you can use the line tool to quickly draw in those fast hi-hat rolls that my boy Rick Beato on YouTube refers to as cicada hi-hats. Okay, not so cool in that use, but there you go. All right, and then of course the quick bounce. Let me see, did I get through everything I wanted to? Yeah, and more. So, quicking. I always tell you guys to highlight what you're going to bounce, because if you've been working longer and you shorten something out, you're going to end up with a 1 minute bounce, but you only have 10 seconds of music. In this case, 5.5 seconds. So I'm going to just come over to File, Bounce to. Remember that you bounced disk. That is for music. We're going to typically do stuff in MP3 now, but we'll talk about what the differences are. But we want to keep things small because we need to send them back and forth and upload them places. Taking a look at the hierarchy here, this is the desktop. It is inside of the folder Review the Interface, as I showed you before, and inside of that subfolder called Bounced Files. Remember that offline being checked will speed up the bounce process. If it is not checked, it will bounce in real time. This one thing would take 5 seconds. A full song would take 3 minutes, or however long it is. Output is the output, whatever we have. Interleaved is very, very important. That is stereo in Pro Tools. If you click multi-mono, you will get 2 files. You don't want that. You don't need to add an MP3 if you've already set MP3 as your choice. Hit bounce. You'll get the metadata window, and you just hit it again, and there you go.